Okay, hopefully this is working. Let's see, hopefully this is working. I had a couple of technical difficulties getting on today, but it seems to be working now, which is great. Nice to be back and to talk to you about our favorite topic of language learning. So thank you very much for coming and for giving your time to join me this evening. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I hope that you'll enjoy the live today. I took a topic to just talk about in the beginning, as I normally do, sort of go through some things that I get asked about with languages. And I asked a number of you as well what you thought on my Instagram channel. I put an Instagram story out ahead of these every week. So if you're not on Instagram, follow me on Instagram, please do follow me, and you'll be able to add your questions in ahead of the talk as well. And what I did was I decided that I would talk about how many words you need to speak a language. And why words? Well, this is the thing. So in terms of language learning, for me, I see the grammar of the language as kind of a skeleton, and I see the words as the meat, the sort of holds everything together. All of the bits that hold the bones together is the flesh of the language, so to speak. And that's kind of how I see languages and language learning. Another thing I sort of see with language learning is how, for example, when we talk about when you learn and you go from sort of this A1 to A2, A2 to B1, B1 to B2, C2, C1 to C2, etc., etc., etc. Ad infinitum, really, with that, because the levels really go probably beyond that, and it's not always easy to measure. What often people ask me is, how much do I need to know? When can I say I'm fluent? What do I do? How much do people know? How much do you know? And this is why I think words are important things. So there are a couple of things to note when you're talking about words, okay? So how many words do you need to know to learn a language? If I were to go back from the feedback that you've given me here, people have put down from the lowest I have here is around 100 to 300, and then the highest bid, should I say, that I have here is 20,000. Somebody wrote 20,000 words is enough to say, to be able to speak a language. Okay, some people have added things like to be at an intermediate stage, it might be a few thousand. To be a beginner in the language, it might be around 500 or something. All of these things, none of them are wrong per se, and it really does depend on what you want to do with the language. Now, this is where the interesting bit comes in for me. When you're learning languages that are very similar to languages you already speak, you get a lot of what I call free words. So these are words that you don't even really need to learn. And many of you out there will know that when you talk about free words, you may realize that, okay, a language like English, where you have words like education, information, as soon as you know those words in English, you know them in many, many languages, particularly the Romance languages, but maybe even in a number of other languages too. Indo-European, but even outside of the Indo-European family of languages, other languages borrow from different places. So Japanese, for example, has an awful lot of English words in it. And then Korean also has borrowed from English. A number of languages borrow from English, particularly more recently, but throughout sort of history, a number of languages have borrowed. A similar thing happens with old Persian, Arabic words that have gone into a number of languages. So, for example, a word I learned in Indonesian or knew in Indonesian immediately was the word for a tool. Now, as a beginner in Indonesian, it's not a word you'd expect me to know, but I know it because the word alat is the same word in Macedonian, the same word in Turkish, and it's from Arabic, and it's gone through into Indonesian. So all of these free words that you hear, you recognize the word, you know it, you understand it, you get those words for free without really having to memorize very much. All you need to do is think, oh, that's the same word as in this language. And then you sort of add the two together and your vocabulary grows. Now, when we talk about that, sometimes what happens with people who seemingly learn languages to a very high level or learn languages very quickly. There are a couple of things that happen. One, if they learn a language to a high level relatively quickly, it could be because they're focused on that language and they're also very conscious of the fact that these languages have things in common. So you may find an Italian speaker learns Spanish, or a Spanish speaker learns Italian relatively quickly compared to, say, someone who speaks a completely different language. Now, I know that you probably think, oh, this is obvious to me. Yes, it kind of is obvious. What's not obvious is when we think we've learned a language because we recognize the words, but actually they're only in our passive understanding. And sometimes they're in our passive understanding, but with the wrong translation. Therefore, we don't understand them in the same way as maybe in the original language or the other languages we speak. I'm going to give you an example. So an example here in the Balkans, we have a word in Macedonian, bashka, and bashka means literally separated, okay? Languages that cross over here through Turkish usually is Albanian as well, and in Albanian, bashk means together. So bashkpunim, pun is the word for work, and punoi is I work, bashkpunoi, working together, so kind of collaboration, right? So bashkpunim would be collaboration in Albanian. You can make words grow that way. But this word bashka and bashk, you would think that it means the same thing. It's originally a Turkish thing. The Albanian etymology isn't so clear to me. It could just be that it's a happenstance that it's been bashk because it's used so much in Albanian. But if you learn the word, you may see it and mistake it for the same sort of cognate, the same word root. In Turkish, though, it doesn't really mean the same thing, because bashka means literally another one of. So bashka bir, another one of whatever. These things can be confusing. The other thing that can happen is that you may recognize some of these things that may sound the same or sound different and have a different meaning. Again, like in Spanish, the very famous sort of embarrassed in English, embarrassé in French, and then embarazada, or in Spanish, which doesn't mean embarrassed, it means pregnant, or constipated in English and constipado or constipada in Spanish do not mean the same thing. You know, constipated in English obviously is a difficulty in one part of the body. Constipado or constipada means to have a cold. So you can see that some of these things, the idea is similar in that if you're constipated, you have a problem passing things from one end of your body. But in Spanish, the idea is constipado because you're stuffed up, you're all bunged up in your nose, and so therefore your sinuses aren't working properly. So these kinds of things I find particularly interesting, but you need to really spend a lot of time to really get the idea of these. What can happen very often is when we look at a language that's similar, we don't always spend the same amount of time learning these words properly. And so things like information and things are easy. Education, information, politics, words like these tend to be the same. But a number of words, base words, may either be completely different, like the word for a dog. Across the Romance languages, you've got perro in Spanish, you've got orgos in Catalan, you've got chien in French, and so on and so forth. And there are so many of these different words that you have to memorize. And what happens when people think that they've basically got to this level with all their words, and they're speaking about politics, they're talking about topics that are really quite complicated because of this shared vocabulary and how easy it is to remember the stuff and understand the stuff. What happens is when they get to a conversation that's talking about their family pets, they don't know the word for dog. And so to the speaker, it sounds very strange because, and also for the person speaking, it feels strange because you almost feel like you've got this this imposter syndrome happening, in that you can talk about what's happening in politics and what's happening with the environment and all these things, but then you can't talk about what kind of dog you've got, or whether you've, you know, what you've got in the kitchen, how you make a cake, or whatever you want to do. You can't talk about things like that because you haven't learned them. So words in terms of numbers and how many words you need to learn, yes, we can kind of say generally this number of words is used in conversation. People talk about from sort of, I've heard people say 600 in a general conversation to 6,000 to understand most things that go on in sort of on TV and in the world. And all of those kinds of things are true. Some people also look at sort of dictionaries that look at frequency, high frequency words. Now, high frequency words tend to be taken from words that are sort of used globally. However, if you go into somebody's home, they're not going to be using high frequency words, but they're going to be using very basic words in terms of the generic language use that they would expect you to know as somebody at, say, a B1, B2, C1, C2 level. However, you as a learner may have skipped a whole range of words because you already got straight to this level of conversation on a very etherical level, and you skipped the entire process of learning the very base words. That's one of the things that can happen when you're learning vocabulary. Now, vocabulary has a huge impact on how quickly you can really communicate. It is actually the meat of the language. I mean, you need to really talk about a lot of different topics to pick up the words. You need to be able to really understand quite a lot of vocabulary and learn a lot of vocabulary by being exposed to it a lot, practicing it a lot, because some of these words are base words of the language are not the high frequency words necessarily, and they still need to be learnt so that you can really feel that you've got a solid base from which to grow in the language. Otherwise, you do feel this imposter syndrome. I'm not so convinced that we should feel the imposter syndrome when we talk about languages that are similar. It depends what our goals are with a language. If you want to go and speak at a conference in Italian, but you already speak Portuguese, Spanish, and French, do you really need to know the word for a backpack, which is completely different in Italian than it is in Spanish or in French? Possibly not. Lotaino is a great word to know. It's a word that's very common if you go to school, if you have children that go to school and they have Italian-speaking friends. The same word for a code, dubino. You don't necessarily need to know these words in Italian. They are extremely different to the Spanish and the French, and not recognizable, understandable at all. But do you need them? You have to weigh up whether or not what you're going to use the language for and how important it is for you to actually know them and to spend the time learning them. Because to learn them, you're going to have to make extra effort to speak to people about certain topics and to take in information about certain topics too. So sort of circling back on this whole idea of how many words do you need to know to speak a language? Well, somebody with 500 words may communicate on certain topics more effectively than somebody with 6,000 words, but none of them are the base words that they need to be able to make a cake, or to go properly shopping, or to talk about their pets, or to talk about certain things that are really important to them, and maybe to a child of 5 years old they want to interact with in that language. Whereas the person with 6,000 words might be able to talk very, very nicely and way better in terms of grammatical accuracy. They may have a richer vocabulary when it comes to expressing presentation information that they want to transmit over to a public at an event. Now, do you see how this is kind of really layered? And this is why it makes it very, very difficult for people who study multiple languages to say the level of the languages, how well they speak them. It's particularly challenging. Now, when you learn a language to a very high level, there's also another issue that comes in as well. And that is the words that you have from one language or another language, or a third or a fourth or a fifth language, they might be common in those languages. But in the new language that you're learning, the people actually who speak the language in the country may not even know what those objects are. I'm going to give you an example. Here in the Balkans, a number of people, just locals, would not know the different types of birds. They would not necessarily know all the different types of flowers. They may confuse them. And it's because those words in general, in the public domain, are not typically used. So in a city environment, like Skopje, for example, they wouldn't necessarily know all of those words. Whereas if you went out into the middle of nowhere, into the countryside, they would potentially know those words because they're more relevant to their life and to their way of living. So, as you can see, this isn't a simple yes or no, a simple this number of words, that number of words. It can be extremely frustrating when you're a learner, when you learn a lot of words and then you don't get to use them, or you've learned that the word you used is actually not really used. Sometimes that happens too. So you'll learn a word for something and people will say, well, actually, yeah, that's the word, but we don't really say it. And so you really need to say this instead. There are many, many things like that that happen as well when you learn a language. And I find it particularly interesting myself. It is a challenge sometimes. And I would say the really important thing when you're learning a language is to make sure that you know the words that you need to know in the first place to be able to communicate the things that are relevant to you. Concentrate and focus on those first. There's no point learning lots and lots and lots of words for lots of things that you're not going to use very quickly, because you need to build the skeleton of the grammar to be able to put the flesh of the vocabulary on it so that you can use it and manipulate it in a sensible and meaningful way. It does mean, though, that you're going to pick these up slowly but surely. Now, going back to this A1, A2, B1, B2 type levels, right? I mentioned that, and it's sort of, we always think of this as kind of this staircase that goes up in nice, even, even sort of segments, right? And it's really nothing like that at all, because what you need to know for an A1 level, actually, I can give you an example from my Turkish. I studied Turkish. It took me 3 months of study, 16 hours a week in class, and then outside I would study as well in addition to that. And it took me 3 months to reach an A1 level. And then I passed the exam, and that's kind of, I passed the exam with, I think, 97%. So I knew pretty much the A1 syllabus in Turkish. And so I can say with quite a lot of certainty that it's not, the A1 level is not what people think that you can just do in a week. It really takes time to kind of even get to the A1 level. And an A1 level, you can communicate your basic ideas in the language. So if you're interested, I made a video years ago when I finished the A1 level to show what I could do at A1 level. And a number of the comments were, actually, no, you speak better than A1. Well, no, I don't, because I sat the A1 exam and I'd not studied any A2 material at all at that point, only A1. And the same thing I did as well when I got to the end of A2. It was a similar amount of time, the 3 months, and then 16 hours again a week in class, and then outside study too, to really retain all of the information. And again, at the end of that, I made a video. People were telling me, oh no, actually, you're probably more like a B1. Well, no, I wasn't. I was an A2, because I passed the exam at A2 and I hadn't studied any material from the B1 course. And in fact, the exam, again, I got around 90 something percent. I think 93% is in my head. It's a long time ago now. So I pretty much knew the A2 syllabus pretty well at that point. And then I carried on with B1. Now, this is where the things get interesting, because if you think it took 16 hours a week over a 6-month period to reach that level, okay, to reach that A2 level. So that's half a year of study, okay, of Turkish full time to get to an A2 level. And then after that, for B1, the length was doubled, or more than doubled, to be able to reach the end of the B1 syllabus. The reason for that is not because of grammar. The grammar, pretty much, when you've got to the end of A2, you've done an awful lot of grammar. When you get to the end of B1, you've pretty much finished the grammar. You're just doing some final sort of touches to the language when you get to the end of B1. What takes a lot of time is just the sheer amount of vocabulary that you have to learn. You have to be sort of subjected to many, many topics, many subjects that will take in lots of vocabulary that you wouldn't necessarily see or normally see if you were just studying sort of on your own and you chose whatever you wanted to look at. when you're actually studying the full course and you're sort of going to a lesson and it's dictated by a teacher who knows the syllabus and knows what you need to demonstrate at that level, it's really, really important that you're sort of able to talk about things that you wouldn't normally talk about. And this is the sort of thing that can come up. So even if you don't know a lot about the topic, right? Even if you don't know a lot, that doesn't really matter so much. As long as you can understand what's going on, you can then manipulate the conversation to move into something you feel more comfortable with. But you need to know that at least that base vocabulary to be able to do that. So I'm going to give you an example. At the moment with Greek, for example, here, I've got the A2 book here, okay, for Click. This is the A2 book for Greek, okay? You can see it's quite thin. I'm going to give you an example now of the B1 book for Greek, and you can see that it's over twice as thick. The other difference that you'll notice if you look into a B1 book of Greek is that you will have, okay, and this isn't even far into the course, okay? You will have texts that really are quite involved. So talking about sort of going to the theatre, we were doing a few weeks ago in a course. So you'll see, you'll have like proper texts in Greek, and they'll be talking about, these are about sort of certain hobbies and things, going into more detail and more depth than what you normally do for just the A1, A2 levels. This is really taking things a bit further. I'm not going to say that, B1, you know everything, but you do go into quite a lot of detail and you do learn a lot of vocabulary. And that is your B1. A similar thing happens when you get to B2. So this is the B2 book for Greek. And you can see, again, it's basically another B1 level. It's an awful lot to do. And then if you want to go to C1, you're looking at this. So that's a lot of material to cover to be able to reach these levels. And so how much vocabulary do you need to know? Honestly, I think it depends, as I said, on what you want to do with the language and what you want to talk about. But generally, to be able to have a basic conversation, I would agree with the comments that I got, that a few hundred words will be enough to have a basic conversation with somebody about certain basic things. You're talking about thousands of words, really, to be able to understand. And not just that you need to know actively, but you'll have to also know words passively, that when people talk about certain topics, you're not lost and you can get the meaning of what's going on, even if you don't know all the vocabulary. And that requires a lot of intake of vocabulary, conversations, so that you get used to this sort of language and that you can then take that and turn that into a conversation, whether it's a conversation you want and you want to steer into the direction you need it to go into to suit your level, or whether you want to change the conversation to go into another level or another subject area, so that you can sort of avoid things that you don't know and you can definitely move forward. I got a question here. Does the CEFR levels, do they really need you to become fluent? Well, they basically, they test you at each level. So there's types of vocabulary that they cover. And when you get to the A1, the A2 levels, really, the vocabulary is pretty fixed. You can just go to the exam after you've studied, and you're pretty much guaranteed that you'll pass if you know the vocabulary. You would do a similar thing probably at B1, maybe at B2, but the thing is, at those levels already, if you're talking at B2 level particularly, many universities will ask for a B2 level to study a subject in the language itself and through that language. So the level that you need to be able to do that is a level where you can actually use the language as a tool to learn another thing. Whether that's a scientific topic, whether that's history, whether that's art, whatever it is, that's the kind of level we're talking about. The C1 level sometimes is asked for certain courses. C1 level is a pretty high level in a language. I mean, if you've got a C1 level, you're speaking the language by anyone's standards, I would say, to a pretty fluent level, regardless of how you define fluent. If you've got a C1 certificate in a language, that's fluent, I think, however you look at it. I would say that really from a B1 you feel pretty comfortable in a number of conversations, and you possibly wouldn't need to, if you've learned all of the content from a B1 level, you would feel pretty comfortable keeping a conversation going in the language. Honestly, depending on the language as well, you may even feel that comfortable after an A2 level, especially if you speak languages that are similar, because it will be enough to show you the differences in the basic grammatical structures, and enough to ask questions of people who speak the language, and to listen to it, and to really get meaningful content back just passively. The other thing that these kind of levels do, these sort of the A2, B1 level in languages, I mean, that's kind of my level in Turkish, is kind of like this B1-ish level, and I have conversations in Turkish. Not saying that I say anything amazingly interesting, or that I don't make mistakes. I definitely do. Turkish grammar is pretty different to the Indo-European languages I speak in terms of how they express things, and sometimes, especially when I'm having a sort of a class or a sort of a conversation chat with an italki teacher, I will actually deliberately make myself say quite difficult things in Turkish, so that I'm forced to get out of my comfort zone and say things in a more Turkish way. The thing that I could do very easily is make Turkish very European in sort of in structure, and a number of people do, and some Turkic languages actually do that. They've been in Europe for a long time, and they mimic sort of some of the Turkic languages spoken in the Balkans, for example, would be very sort of European in style in the way they construct the sentences, whereas actually true Turkish would be very much this very different way of constructing things, especially with verbal forms. And that just takes time and practice to sort of get right. And I still get that wrong, and I still have to think quite a lot sometimes when I want to make a very convoluted construction in Turkish. And I still might get it wrong even after I've thought about it. But what will happen generally is I will make an effort to do that if I can. When I'm in normal conversation, I have to be very honest and say that I will go for the easiest route. If my goal is communication, I will just step it down a notch and say what I definitely know is right, and just go for that. It's simply because it's a comfort zone thing. I know the person will understand me if I say it in this way, even though it's not the most perfect Turkish that I could use. It's sometimes easier to do that. So yes, it's kind of there's a lot going on there. I love that you're writing all these questions. So thank you all for the questions. Okay. What's the best place to buy second-hand language learning books at low cost? Oh, that would depend on the country and the place you're in. I haven't got a clue in terms of the very best. Possibly on eBay you'd find some, if that's quite an international place to look. Sometimes on Amazon as well, they sell the sort of used versions of languages. I'm going to try and see if I can answer some of your questions here relating to the topic, and then I'll come to any other questions that I can find as well. Hello to everyone. Sorry that I sort of start with this sort of whole thing about my topic, and then I kind of get into it, and I hope you enjoy it, and then I come back for the questions. So good to see you all there. Thank you. Merci. Bonjour. Cześć. Merhaba. Hola. So hello everyone. Je pense apprendre la langue des signes française. As-tu déjà essayé d'apprendre une langue des signes? Oui, j'ai fait avec la langue en fait du Royaume-Uni, BSL, British Sign Language. J'ai fait ça. J'ai étudié c'est en fait c'est un centre où on peut l'apprendre au Royaume-Uni, ou à Chester où j'habitais. Et puis j'ai fait pendant 1 an. C'était super, c'était très intéressant en fait à faire. J'ai adoré, mais malheureusement, je n'ai pas l'occasion d'utiliser maintenant parce que ici, en Macédoine, c'est assez difficile à utiliser une langue de signes de notre pays. Mais j'ai commencé avant la Covid, j'ai commencé à apprendre la langue d'ici, mais je crois que je n'avais fait 2 mois, peut-être 1 mois, 2 mois. Je commençais à utiliser les signes avec des gens et tout ça, Mais après, il y avait le Covid et c'était impossible de continuer avec la langue parce on pouvait pas aller au centre-ville pour le faire en fait. Donc c'était impossible. Et à mon avis, il vaudrait mieux apprendre dans un cours avec des autres personnes qui vont utiliser la langue avec toi. Et ça, c'est pour moi la meilleure chose avec une langue comme ça parce qu'il faut vraiment regarder, voir tout ce qu'ils font avec les doigts et apprendre vraiment à communiquer comme eux. Et ça se fait bien dans un centre pour la langue, en fait, pour l'apprentissage. Donc, mais je crois que c'est super. C'est super. Je te jure, tu vas l'aimer. J'aimerais bien revenir en fait à cette langue ici, à la forme macédonienne, parce que j'aimerais bien l'apprendre. Okay, I'm going to see if I can see any more of these questions now. Okay, how memory techniques help us to remember more words within a day? So there are many memory techniques that work differently for different people. So some people use kind of memory palaces, which are, if you don't know about memory palaces, then they may or may not work for you. It takes a bit of time investment to understand how they work. What's cool about learning about them is that you learn some memory techniques in the process. So the idea of making stories up in your head, making them as vivid as possible, making them as memorable as possible, and so that you have these kind of things when you think of the language and you think of how you would say a certain thing. I would say, for example, using quite sometimes sort of sometimes quite adult stuff. It may involve things that you would never imagine normally. It can sort of help make things stand out sometimes, or things that you would maybe make you feel a bit grossed out. Like I remember that I learned the word for in French many years ago for what's the word now? Okay, try to think what the word was, and it grossed me out. But I know how it's so. It was the word glaire, and it's the word for phlegm in French, like phlegm in your throat. And the way I remembered it was I pictured our then Prime Minister Tony Blair. So I got the sound from the Tony Blair, and then him going and spitting out phlegm, and that kind of helped me to remember the word because I'd not heard it before when I first heard it. Obviously, it wasn't a word that we talked about a lot at school, and so I that's how I started remembering it. I also remember certain things for other for other reasons as well, like I don't know, that the word for window is in Macedonian, for example, is jam. So jam is the common word. It's a Turkic word. It's also used in Romanian, and so this word jam, I think of the word jam in English and imagine jam smeared on the window in the Balkans, in Romania, and in North Macedonia, and that's how I imagine the word jam and remember it. There are other words that I remember as well for very different reasons. So sometimes coming up with these kinds of memory techniques, the sort of stories and things, help you to sort of remember or associate words with other things in your head. The key thing is having hooks in your mind as to what that means in another language. So, for example, when you know more languages, you can basically do this with more languages. So when I learned the word for quick or fast in Swedish, which is vit, I thought, sorry, white in Swedish. You'll know why I said that now. So white in Swedish, vit, because in French it's vite, which is fast. If you go very fast and you run very fast, you can imagine that you turn into this white light that runs to Sweden. And then that's kind of how I started hanging on these other words. Words, for example, like in German, kennen. I remember ken because in English we have beyond my ken. It's beyond my knowledge. And so the word kennen and it means to know, but it's not the same as to know like Ken. It's you remember then the difference because you make the story so complicated that you remember it because it's so involved, right? It gets a bit stupid. But these are the kinds of things that I do with languages. I find it pretty interesting. I learned a new word in Macedonian actually 3 days ago, and it's the word for a lilac tree. I'd never heard of it before because no one really talks about it around the dinner table. But it's so it's Yorgovan is the word for a lilac tree. And the way I remember it is I imagine a lilac tree covered in a Macedonian quilt, and a quilt in Macedonian is Yorgan. So Yorgovan, I just remember going to the lilac tree and putting a quilt around it, and that creates my Yorgovan. So that's my lilac tree. So there, there are lots of things I do like this. And this is why when people say, oh, the more languages you know, it's easier to learn another one. It's true in the fact that you have more things to hang on with these memories, these hooks, right? It helps for that kind of stuff because you can think of way more stuff that you need to remember. And this is sort of how welcome to my world, welcome to my mind. This is kind of how my mind works constantly. I'm always thinking of etymologies. I'm always thinking of words that sound similar. I'm always thinking of things that will help me to remember certain things. Just because, yeah, it really is sort of, yeah. These are the kind of things that I do. When I start learning words in this way, though, in the beginning, it takes a bit of time for it to sink in properly. So I need to go back, but sometimes it's a good thing to jog my memory that, okay, that's how I sort of remembered it. And sometimes the story remains, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the word remains immediately, sometimes it doesn't. But you can guarantee that sort of eventually it will get there, and it takes time for this sort of process. But this is kind of how I do it. Hope that helps. It was a very long answer to your question. I'm sorry for everyone else who have sort of just not. It did feel very related to this. Okay, 大家好，大家好. I like it. Hello everyone. Yes. Hallo liebe Richard. Okay, schön Livestream. Von dir persönlich finde ich Level etwas problematisch, weil Level niemals wirklich sagen, wie gut man ist. Das stimmt auch, ja. Man muss eigentlich herausfinden, was das bedeutet. Und das bedeutet ja verschiedene Sachen für verschiedene Leute. Also für mich zum Beispiel, also mit A2 oder A1, konnte ich schon ziemlich gut sprechen. Also, und das heißt, weil ich eigentlich andere Sprachen spreche und weil ich so viele Sprachen eigentlich studiert und gelernt habe, hat es mir auch geholfen, ein bisschen so fließend, fließend zu sprechen, aber nicht fließend. Du weißt, wie ich das meine, ne? Was wollte ich sagen? Ja, okay, das eigentlich mit auf eine Sprache zum Beispiel wie Türkisch. Ich hatte zum Beispiel ja 97% für meine Prüfung, also A1-Prüfung und dann 4 oder 93, ich weiß nicht mehr, für A2. Und ja, für mich war es eigentlich, das hieß, ich konnte alles sagen, was eigentlich da drinnen stand. Also was wir in der Schule gelernt haben, wusste ich ja, also fast 100%ig alles. Und das hieß auch, ich konnte das alles benutzen, wie ich das wollte. Für andere Leute, die auch die Prüfungen bestanden haben, die brauchten nur 62%, denke ich mal. Also das heißt, es gibt ja schon so einen Unterschied von 30%. Also das ist eine Menge. Also wenn man so denkt, ja, wie viele Wörter heißt es eigentlich? Das sind ja schon viele Wörter und auch viele Fehler auch in der Sprache. Und deshalb macht es schon was aus, was A1, A2 oder B1 oder B2 für dich heißt. Und ich meine persönlich, dass jeder muss eigentlich herausfinden, was für sich selbst eigentlich bedeutet. Also für mich war es so, dass ja A1, A2, das hieß ja alles lernen und fast ja alles auswendig können. Für andere Leute, die werden sagen, ich habe schon die A2 oder zur Prüfung bestanden und vielleicht deshalb dachten die Leute, dass sie eigentlich B1 dem B1-Niveau war, nach dem A2. Und das war ja für mich Quatsch, aber ja, so ist es eigentlich. Let me see. Salut, j'écris de Québec. C'est le meilleur. Merci, c'était très gentil. Merci, c'est très gentil. Merci pour tes mots. Okay. Okay. Platforms to prove our fluency within any language, certification, setting up a career. Yeah, I think, well, you can go to sit the exams in certain languages. So certain countries have these for their languages. You can sit the exams. In fact, I'm going to be sitting an exam for Cornish next month, and that will be the grade 1 exam for Cornish, which, if I compare it to what I know in Turkish or what I knew in Turkish, is somewhere between an A1 and A2, possibly getting closer to an A2, but it's somewhere there in the middle, somewhere there. I've been doing it for like 1 day a week on the course since September, so not at the same sort of intensity as Turkish, which is why I say it's kind of an A1, A2-ish level. And some places will offer them for these kinds of languages, like Cornish. You can do it very easily and very cheaply. For other languages, it can be expensive. For English, it's quite expensive. For French, Spanish, and German, it can be quite expensive to sit the exams. But they do have institutes that will provide you an opportunity with to be able to sit the exams as well. So you can do them. Depends on the language you want to do. What I find is once you've done it in one or two languages and then you learn other languages, if you put them on your CV and you go for an interview, they will often take it that you understand what these levels mean if you've already done them. Same way as I've done a degree in languages at university, so people often just understand and they take it that I know what I'm talking about when I say I've studied another language to a level. I'm less likely, I guess, to inflate my level because first of all, it's not in my interest. I don't want to look like a fool when I go for the interview, but also I have an understanding of what's involved in the language and I can speak about it in a fairly realistic way, I think. So yeah, solo desde Haiti. Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Haiti. I'm actually learning Haitian Creole at the moment. It's so cool. I do it on a Saturday on Clubhouse, and I really, really love it. It's very, very cool. We've only been doing the pronunciation so far, so I'm nowhere near anywhere at the moment, but it's been a lot of fun. Hej Richard, vad kul att du ser det. Okej, igen. Ja, tack. Ja, det är fint. Tack så mycket. Please reveal your secret fuel to become fluent in a language. Yeah, unfortunately, there's nothing I can show you. So C vitamins or something. Vitamin C. No. Unfortunately, it's just a lot of study and practicing as much as possible and listening to the language as much as possible. Kind of sitting there, crossing your fingers, hoping that the language will go in and getting annoyed with yourself isn't going to work. You have to get out of that comfort zone and do something. What can happen very often, what does happen very often, is that you get to this kind of A2 level, which is perfectly fine for doing a lot of things. And I've had this with a few languages where I got to an A2 level, kind of an A2 to B1-ish level, and I wanted to go further, but it takes an awful lot more work to take languages beyond that because of the vocabulary that you need to learn and have to be exposed to, have to use. But what happens is over time, you do build it up gradually. It just takes a lot longer time, unless you're doing something very active to expose yourself to the language. Je begrijpt alles wat in de bovenstaande talen geschreven is. Ja, dat wel. Dat doe ik wel. Zelfs mijn eigen moederstaal, Nederlands. Ja, dat kan ik wel, ja. Ja, ik kan Nederlands. Ja, mooie taal, hè? Even kijken. What about the Polyglot Gathering in 2021? The Polyglot Gathering is run by friends of mine. So Peter Balash and the team are putting it on this month. I highly encourage you to check out their website and their Facebook page for more information. It's Polyglot Gathering, and it's happening this month in May, in about 2 weeks' time. So I really encourage you to be there. I'm going to be there myself. I'm going to be talking as well. I'm going to a topic for people, and And so I please do go and enjoy. It's a sister event of the Polyglot Conference, which is the one that I run, and the Polyglot Conference will happen in October. So love to see you at both events. I will be, well, at the moment you can actually, if you want to talk at the Polyglot Conference, you can sign up to talk already, and sort of put in your ideas for what you'd like to talk about. And I highly encourage as many of you as possible to do that, because it's amazing what we all have to share with each other. And yeah, so I'd love to hear from as many of you as possible. And you're all welcome, of course. And you're even welcome now on the Polyglot Conference page to just go to polyglotconference.com and sign up for the forum. Remember that the Polyglot Conference and the Polyglot Gathering are two separate events with two different teams. So anything Polyglot Gathering related, or if you're expecting something to happen in May at the Polyglot Conference, go to the Polyglot Gathering and make sure you sign up and register at the Polyglot Gathering site for your ticket to join. And yeah, I'd love to see you there. Okay, ja. Wiederholen und in Sätzen verwenden, ja, ganz genau, finde ich auch. Das ist eigentlich es ist auch sehr gut. So, wenn man das macht, dann kann man schon ja, vieles machen, muss ich sagen, ja. Okay, Deutsch, okay, mal gucken. I really don't think there's a hard gap between the levels, but rather an inconsistent barrier which is connected with some grammatical knowledge, use of vocabulary, etc. Lucas, yes and no. So grammatical knowledge, probably what you learn in terms of grammar at the different levels stops at around B2 level. So there's not really any grammar to be learned really when you're talking about kind of after B2. There could be some fine things that you might learn at C2, C1, C2, but they could also be things that monolingual speakers of that language don't know themselves. So it's arguable whether or not that's real learning, or whether that's just sort of polishing a language with something that you may not necessarily need ever. You're right in that there is no real hard boundary. So this is possibly also why when people hear me speak certain languages, they think mistakenly assume that I have studied beyond the level that's prescribed by the books, for example. So I often have that in Turkish and in Greek, that people say that I'm beyond a level that I'm actually beyond, and I correct and say, no, actually that's all I've studied. But you're right in this fact that, and the reason that there is that is because clearly as you learn, your learning goes up steadily. Okay, you don't just wake up one day and speak another level. You kind of grow up gradually, and there's kind of a gray area in between each level. And I was explaining this in German, which is why I've just realized now that I was saying it in German and not in English. So for example, when I said that I passed my Turkish exam with a 97% at A1 and then a 93 or 94% at A2, the pass rate for that exam, for both of those exams, was 62%, I think. And so some people in the group passed at 62 or 63 or 64 or 65%. Now, the difference between me getting 97% or 94% or whatever it was is a 30% gap in knowledge in terms of grammar, mastery of the grammar, and in terms of the lexical knowledge, so vocabulary. So there is a huge difference even when you think of that. So someone can say they've passed an exam, but they've passed at 62%, and somebody else has passed at nearly 100%, and there is a huge difference between those. So yes, there is a difference, and there is a grey area, and I absolutely agree with you. The only thing I slightly think that is different is with grammatical learning. You may make mistakes, but you may still make mistakes at the C1, C2 level. You may never go away. I had a teacher of Spanish that made the same mistake forever, and she lived in the UK for like 40 years. Her English was amazing, but she always made the same mistake with two things. She used to say pass the register instead of to take the register, as we say in English. And she used to say, I'm going to pass the audio or pass the cassette, instead of I'm going to replay the cassette or the audio. She'd always say that because that's how you'd say it in Spanish, and it was never corrected. So there'd be kind of things like that that would stick, even though her ability in English was absolutely outstanding and probably one of the best. She had a very thick Spanish accent, but that didn't matter because her knowledge of the language was absolutely amazing. I mean, she's one of the best English as a second language speakers I've heard. And it goes against everything that people say about, oh, having a perfect accent or having this, or having... No, her command of words, vocabulary generally, command of grammar, her understanding of English, intrinsically, she just knew so much of the many people who are monolingual. And she just blew me away every time I heard her speak English. But there were those two mistakes, and they always stayed, and I never ever wanted to correct her, and I never wanted her to correct them, because I always thought they were extremely endearing. But that's just me, you know. I like these kind of things. Okay. Also, wie ist die Pandemie? And okay, that's nicht für mich. Also, I'm glad that I'm getting some people agreeing with this about the vocabulary and the knowledge. It's really nice to see that you take on board some of the things that I say, and that you agree. And it's nice to say it's not sort of, you're talking nonsense again. Why are you talking nonsense about language learning? That's not at all what we understand about it. Have you ever worked in a company where the language spoken wasn't my native language? Yes, I have. So I've worked through a number of languages. In fact, when I was in the Netherlands, officially the company language was English, but actually I spoke pretty much anything but English during the day. A lot of Dutch. Dutch was kind of the language I used with people, like work colleagues, who were Dutch speaking. But then for the actual job, I used Swedish, I used French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, German, and then Dutch, and on occasion English. So 8 languages I used on a daily basis for that job. That was 2 years. I was 2 years in Rotterdam. But yeah, I basically worked and did a lot of my day-to-day stuff in Dutch. So yeah. About Asimil, I like Asimil. I like the company. I like the people that work there, and I think that the books are nice. And yeah, I mean, I have a lot of Asimil books. I mean, you may actually see on my I've got a picture actually with my Asimil collection. Yeah, they're pretty good. Some of them are a lot of fun to read as well. They're quite there's an Esperanto one, and they kind of have jokes all the way through them. And I think the one that I always remember, the sort of was it in? Oh no, it was the Serbo-Croat one actually, and it was about Esperanto, and they said they were sort of doing this typical Balkan mother type thing where they get together and they say how amazing their children are, and then said, "Oh, my child speaks whatever language like a native," and then this one person said, "Yeah," and the idea was that there's no Esperanto native speakers at the time. Of course, that's not true, but it was still quite funny the way it was put, because it's an older version, of course, of the course. My son speaks Esperanto like a native, and yeah, I thought it stood out to me because it was quite funny to read in this old version of the Serbo-Croat book. But yeah, I like that they inject humor into it, and I think it's quite a fun thing to do with languages, because it helps you to remember when something's a bit weird. It helps you to remember. I'm so glad that you've enjoyed the topic. Thank you for doing that. Yeah, the topics, if you've got suggestions for topics that you'd like to hear me talk about, please do feel free to write to me and let me know. I'm always happy to sort of listen to your ideas and what's important to you. I do quite like sort of thinking about things that people talk to me about and seeing how interesting they are to you all. So yes, yo creo que he aprendido, a ver, no lo veo bien, suficientemente palabras españolas. Después no lo veo bien, ¿eh? No sé qué pasa. Expresiones, ¿vale? Y palabras más eficiente, y me cuesta. Uy, perdón, pero no lo veo bien, ¿eh? Para aprender más. Me cuesta para aprender más. Sí, lo que pasa con idiomas es que siempre hay otra cosa para aprender, no es como, por ejemplo, no es como una montaña, va subiendo y ya estás encima y ya. No, con idiomas siempre hay más para aprender. Así que, y para mí es igual, ¿eh? Con todos los idiomas, incluso en inglés. El inglés también, tampoco lo hablo, pero lo hablo, claro, es mi idioma, y lo hablo creo que lo hablo bastante bien y tengo un vocabulario bastante amplio también, pero lo que pasa con un idioma como el inglés o como el español o lo que sea, es que son idiomas donde hay una cantidad enorme de palabras, de expresiones, de todo, así que argot, todo lo que sea, así que cuesta mucho y siempre estoy aprendiendo yo también, ¿eh? Y creo que los monolingües también siguen aprendiendo en sus idiomas. Igualito todo. A ver, um, okay, so I have, how long have you been learning Turkish? I think I've mentioned the Turkish one a few times, so I'm not going to go back to that. If it wasn't clear, please feel free to go back and let me know if it wasn't clear. So Turkish I did, yeah, it's 3 months, and then a year for B1. So yeah, a year and a half, roughly 2 years, a year and a half, 2 years. And then there wasn't a course for B2, so I had to stop, and then I just sort of practiced on my own. You've also been using Teach Yourself for Turkish. Yeah, Teach Yourself is pretty cool. Both, I mean, you can use both. You know, this is the thing. I mean, you can dip into one or the other and sort of get extra help sort of reading through. Use one as a book that you read, and use one as a book that you study with, and vice versa. You can do that kind of thing quite easily. It's quite cool. Okay, so I'm trying to see if there are any more questions here that I can see. I can see a lot of people talking to each other. That's amazing. I like that you all interact with each other. You'd like me to talk about pronunciation. Okay. How you get proper pronunciation in a language. Wow, that's a minefield of a topic. We can talk about it, sure. I'll think about how to talk about that and to do it properly with you. Thank you for the suggestion. Started reading children's books in Spanish. That's brilliant. Yeah, children's books can be cool, but they can also, to say a but, it's not that I don't think they're cool. I'm not saying I think they're cool, but, and therefore I don't think they're cool. I do think they're cool, and I think they can be cool. The only issue with them sometimes is that the vocabulary is extremely strange, or can be extremely strange, because it's about witches and it's about sort of mystical beings, and very often about sort of very strange things. So yeah, I like them, but sometimes they can be a bit too much, especially in the beginning when you start learning a language. I found that with German particularly, people, the children in the family would give me these books in German to read, and they were written, first of all, in the old German script, which was a nightmare to read as a someone who's not grown up used to listening or reading that kind of sort of text in that way. That font is quite challenging to read, but then also the words were very, very strange. So swings and roundabouts. Sometimes the grammar can be quite cool to learn though. But yeah, absolutely. And they do often go to the, like for French, I'd say be very aware if you try this with French, with books and children's books, that they don't use a tense. They use a tense that you don't use in speech in French. So in French, it can be a bit of a nightmare because you'll see this way that they write, and actually people don't use it. It's called the passé simple, and people don't speak that way. In Italian as well, this happens in Italian with passato remoto, where people write in a way that's not really used in speech properly in Italian anymore. In Spanish, it's not a problem, but in these languages, it is a problem to read because you're basically not reading the types of verbal tenses that you would need to read as a beginner, particularly. So I would say, yeah. I mean, when I was talking with Ollie Richards about putting together the French stories book, this is one of the things I mentioned, and so we purposely used tenses that you need as a beginner and not the sort of the passé simple, because it made no sense teaching people passé simple at A1, A2, B1 level. It just made no sense at all. So just so you know, that's why that book is written in that way, so that it allows you to actually see language in a way that you're going to use and see around you. Okay. Anyway, I have to dash now because it's the hour. It's been lovely talking to you, and thank you for coming again to see me and to join me and to ask questions and to comment. I really, really appreciate it. Please do follow me anywhere you want, interact with me anywhere you want, and I will look forward to seeing you again next week. Take care. Enjoy your week wherever you are in the world, and see you soon. Thank you. Bye bye.